The great hall of Renholt blazed with autumn fire that night, and every soul beneath its vaulted ceiling believed they knew exactly who mattered and who did not. They were wrong. 10,000 candles trembled in their sconces, throwing amber light across garlands of copper leaves and bronze chrysanthemums, across bushels of russet apples heaped in silver bowls, across long tables where wine gleamed dark as garnet. The harvest masque had drawn every name of consequence for 40 miles, and they had come dressed as gods and harlequins, as swans and serpents, their faces hidden behind masks of gilt and feather and jewel, their laughter rising toward the painted ceiling like smoke. Musicians in the gallery drew their bows across trembling strings, and the sound wound through the perfume and the heat until the whole vast room seemed to sway, drunk on its own splendor. And through the heart of all that splendor, unhurried and unremarkable, moved a young woman in dove gray. She wore no mask. There was no need. No one looked at her long enough to require a face to be hidden. Her gown was plain, the color of a November sky before rain, unadorned by lace or ribbon. Her chestnut hair was pinned back without ornament, in a fashion no lady in that room would have permitted her maid to attempt. She carried a folded shawl over one arm, and she moved among the shimmering crowd the way a shadow moves along a wall, present, necessary, and entirely unseen. Her name was Adelaide Vane, and she was, by every account that mattered in that room, nobody at all. Adelaide, the word cut through the music, sharp and imperious, and Adelaide turned toward it at once, the way a compass turns north. Adelaide, where has the wretched girl gone? Here, my lady, she said, and there was no hurry in her voice, no fluster, only a calm and even steadiness as she crossed to the tall figure who had summoned her. Lady Ophelia Farrington stood at the center of a knot of admirers like a jewel in a setting, and she was, it had to be admitted, magnificent. She wore emerald silk that caught the candlelight and threw it back in green flame, and diamonds glittered cold at her throat and wrists and in the dark coils of her hair. Her mask was a slender thing of gold filigree that did nothing to soften the imperious line of her mouth. She was a woman in her middle 40s who had spent every one of those years learning precisely how to look at other people as though they were furniture, and she turned that look now upon Adelaide with the faint impatience of someone addressing a lamp that has begun, inexplicably, to speak. "My fan," Lady Farrington said. "I set it down somewhere, and now it is gone, and this room is an oven, and I am expected to simply expire here in the heat while you wander about doing heaven knows what. Find it. The ivory one, not the painted one. If you bring me the painted one, I shall know you have not been listening," which would surprise no one. She turned back to her circle without waiting for a reply, already forgetting that Adelaide existed. "You must forgive her," she said to the gentleman on her left, in a voice pitched to Carrie. "She has the wits of a wet hen. My poor cousin took her on out of charity, and I have inherited the burden, as one inherits the gout." A ripple of amusement passed through the glittering circle. "Wherever did you find her?" drawled a woman in peacock blue, her mask a fan of iridescent feathers. "She dresses like a Quaker governess." "She dresses," said Lady Farrington, "like precisely what she is, a girl with no prospects, no fortune, no family worth the name, and no expectation of ever having any of the three. One does not gild a turnip." She sipped her wine, though there is something almost restful about her. One never has to worry that she will outshine anyone. The laughter came again, warmer now, cruel in the easy way that cruelty becomes when it is shared among people who feel themselves entirely safe. Adelaide, 3 steps away, heard every word. She did not flinch, did not color, did not drop her eyes or do any of the small involuntary things that the wounded do. She simply inclined her head a fraction, as though the words had been an instruction rather than an insult, and turned to find the ivory fan. She found it within the minute, tucked beneath a napkin where Lady Farrington had abandoned it, and placed it into her mistress's gloved hand without a word. Lady Farrington took it without looking, without thanks, as one takes air. And Adelaide stepped back into the shadows and folded her hands and waited to be needed again. Around her, the mask churned on. She had learned, in the 2 years since she had come to serve Lady Farrington, the whole grammar of her own invisibility, how to move through a crowded room without touching anyone, how to anticipate a want before it was spoken, how to be a pair of hands and never, ever a person. She was spoken over, spoken past, spoken about. She was, to that whole shining assembly, less a guest than a fixture, and they used her without thought, without gratitude, without the faintest flicker of curiosity about what might be happening behind her calm gray eyes. And behind her calm gray eyes, a very great deal was happening. For Adelaide Vane knew this house the way one knows a thing in the bones. She knew that the third stair from the landing sighed under a foot, that behind the great tapestry in the west corridor there was a door that had not been opened in a decade. And she knew, though no one in that glittering, sneering room could have dreamed it, the true name of the man in the great portrait that hung above the hearth at the head of the hall. She let her eyes travel to it now, across the sea of feathers and gilt. He hung there above the mantel in oils gone soft and golden with age, a broad-shouldered man in a dark green coat, his hand resting on the head of a hunting hound, his eyes warm and steady and touched with a private amusement, as though the painter had caught him in the middle of some kind thought. The late Lord Edmund Renholt, master of this hall for 40 years, and dead now for 3. To the guests he was merely a dead man in a frame, a name on a deed that had passed, as such names pass, to the living. Adelaide looked at him, and something moved behind her stillness that was not grief, and was not quite anything a bystander could have named. There he is. The voice was young, male, and pleased with itself, and it belonged, when she turned, to Julian Farrington. He had come to a stop before the portrait, with a small crowd in his wake, a glass in his hand and a fine flush of wine and self-satisfaction on his handsome face. He was perhaps 28, dressed like a prince in a coat of deep blue crusted with gold embroidery, a half mask of black and gold pushed carelessly up onto his brow so that everyone might admire the whole of his features. He was Lady Farrington's nephew. And he was, everyone knew it, everyone said it, the heir. The great house and its lands and its rents had come down at last to him, and he wore the knowledge of it like a second, warmer coat. The old man himself, Julian said, lifting his glass toward the portrait in a lazy salute. Uncle Edmund. Though I never called him uncle to his face, God rest him, sour old recluse. By every account, shut himself up in this pile for the last years of his life and would see almost no one. He grinned at his companions. He would hardly know the place tonight, would he? All this life in it. I dare say we are doing him a service, warming up his cold old rooms at last. You'll do the estate credit, Farrington, said one of the young men at his shoulder. Better than a hermit ever did. I mean to, Julian said, and there was something harder under the lightness now. I have plans for Renholt. Grand ones. The old man let it molder. I shall make it blaze. He turned as he spoke, gesturing at the golden room, and his eye fell, in passing, upon the gray figure standing quiet by the wall. For a moment something flickered across his face, not recognition, only the faint, reflexive distaste of a man whose eye has snagged on a smudge on a clean window. "You," he said. "Girl, my aunt will want more wine, and there's a draft on the east side she'll complain of within the hour. Make yourself useful." He did not wait for an answer. He had already turned back to his admirers. Now, where was I? Ah, my plans. Adelaide inclined her head to the back of his gold-embroidered coat. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, and she meant something by it that he would never in 100 years have understood. She did not move at once toward the wine. She let her gaze go once more to the warm-eyed man in the portrait, and then she let it fall, carefully, without seeming to a different figure altogether, one that no one else in that whole bright room appeared to have noticed at all. An old man stood in the deep shadow of the doorway at the far end of the hall. He was tall, though age had bent him a little at the shoulders, and his silver hair was brushed neatly back from a lined and weathered face. His coat was dark and plainly cut, worn thin at the elbows, the coat of a man who has spent his life in useful work and never once in vanity. He held himself very still, a cup of untasted cider in his knotted hands, and he was watching the girl in gray. His name was Corbin, and he had been steward of Renholt for 35 years. He had served the late Lord Edmund in matters that no other living soul knew of, and there was in his kind and steady eyes, as they rested upon Adelaide across the crowded Golden Hall, something that was not pity. Pity looks down. Corbin's gaze did not. It rested on the plain gray girl the way a man's gaze rests on a thing long buried and at last about to be uncovered, with patience and with grief, and with a fierce and secret hope. Adelaide felt the weight of it, as she always did, and she gave him, in return, the smallest thing, a lowering of her lashes, a stillness held a half-beat too long. A message passed between two people in a language of which the rest of the room did not know a single word. "Not yet," the stillness said. "But soon." Corbin gave the faintest nod, so slight that it might have been the settling of an old man's tired neck, and then he turned and was gone through the dark doorway, back into the older, colder bones of the house. Across the hall, in a curtained alcove where the candlelight scarcely reached, a second man stood watching the room with very different eyes. He was perhaps 50, austere and spare, dressed entirely in unrelieved black that set him apart from every jeweled reveler as a crow is set apart in a garden of peacocks. He wore no mask. His face was long and grave and clean-shaven, his eyes the cool gray of slate, and against his chest, held there by one flat pale hand, he pressed a slim leather case of documents as a man presses something that might at any moment be taken from him. Mr. Alistair Reeve had not danced, had not drunk, had exchanged no words with any guest since he arrived. He had simply watched Lady Farrington laugh, watched Julian preen, watched the girl in gray move quiet and unregarded through the heart of it all. Once, only once, his cool gray eyes met Corbin's across the room, in the instant before the old steward vanished, a look brief as the flare of a struck match. Then his gaze dropped to the leather case beneath his hand, and the corner of his austere mouth moved, not into a smile but into something grim and certain and final. The expression of a man who has waited a very long time to open a door, and has just heard the clock begin to strike the hour. Outside, beyond the tall dark windows, the servants of Renholt were carrying the great harvest lanterns out onto the terrace and setting them in their long row upon the balustrade, ready to be lit, ready for the unmasking. ready for the moment, not far off now, when every face in that room would be revealed at last in the honest, golden light. Every face. Inside, the music soared, and the whole glittering circle spun on, warm and certain and blind, entirely unaware that a reckoning had already walked in among them on quiet feet, in a plain gray gown, and was even now pouring wine, and waiting, and watching them all with calm and knowing eyes. And above the mantel, warm-eyed and dignified in his dark green coat, the late Lord Edmund Renholt looked down upon his house and upon his daughter, and upon all the bright and unsuspecting faces gathered there, and seemed in the trembling candlelight almost to smile. The masks made the cruelty easier. Behind a scrap of feathered silk, people said what they would never say barefaced. A woman in a peacock mask drifted past on the arm of a harlequin, and let her painted gaze slide over Adelaide's gray gown, her practical boots, the little lapdog that trembled against her sleeve. "There it is," she murmured, "the little gray mouse. I think Ophelia keeps it about her the way some ladies keep a plain cousin, to make the rest of us shine the brighter." "A charity, then," the harlequin said. "A vanity," the woman corrected, and they swept on, delighted with themselves. Adelaide's expression did not so much as flicker. She stroked the trembling dog once, gently, and let the words fall past her like water off slate. Across the room, Julian Farrington was holding court, a cluster of admirers laughing before he had quite finished his jests. His gaze, roaming lazily over them, found Adelaide by the window, and some idle appetite for an easy triumph decided upon her. "Ah," he said, loudly enough to turn heads, lifting his glass toward her. "But we are forgetting our most devoted guest. Or not our guest, precisely, our fixture. Miss Vane. Come, do not lurk by the glass like a draught we've forgotten to stop up. Come and be seen." Adelaide understood the shape of the thing at once, that to refuse would be to seem stung, and that Julian would only follow the refusal with something worse and call it wit. So she came, settling the little dog upon a cushioned bench, and crossed the floor toward him with an unhurried grace that ought to have warned him, if he had had the eyes to read it, that this was not a woman who came because she feared him. She inclined her head. "Sir, there," Julian said, turning to his audience like a showman. "Observe, is she not the very picture of humble industry? Gray as a Tuesday, quiet as a Sunday. My aunt tells me she is quite indispensable, that she can mend a hymn and settle a bill and soothe a headache. A paragon." He sipped his wine. "One does wonder, Miss Vane, that a creature of such prodigious usefulness has never risen to anything above the carrying of a lapdog. Tell us, is it want of ambition, or only want of opportunity?" The circle laughed, and a woman in a swan mask covered her mouth and whispered something to her neighbor that made the neighbor laugh harder. Adelaide let the laughter run its course. She had found that silence, held a moment past its comfortable length, did more than any retort, that a crowd braced for a stammering denial did not quite know what to do with a woman who simply waited, calm-eyed, until the joke curdled a little in the telling. "I have found, sir," she said at last, her voice low and even and carrying further than she raised it, "that usefulness is its own kind of opportunity. There is a great deal one comes to know, in a house, by being thought too small to notice. It was almost nothing." But something in the way she said it, the faint unhurried weight upon the word "no," made the swan-masked woman's smile falter, and made Julian, for the briefest instant, blink. Then he recovered, and laughed too loudly. "Wisdom from the mouse-hole," he declared. "You see how she earns her keep. Go on, then, paragon. My aunt's fan has gone quite unattended." He waved her off with 2 fingers and turned back to his glittering flock. Adelaide inclined her head again, precisely as much as courtesy required and not 1 degree more, and returned to the window. If her hands were steady, and they were, it was because she had held far heavier things than an insult, and held them longer. But she was aware of a warmth high on her cheekbones that had nothing to do with the lanterns, and aware, too, of those warm, dark, painted eyes that seemed, from across the room, to be resting upon her alone. She did not look up. To do so now, with the laughter still settling, would have been to give something away, and she had guarded the secret too long to spend it on a moment of hurt pride. She did not know yet how near the hour was. Along the eastern wall, half screened by a great arrangement of copper chrysanthemums, there was a shallow alcove where 2 men stood close together in low and grave conversation. Unremarked in the general brilliance, old Mr. Corbin and Mr. Alistair Reeve, who had arrived at Wrenholt not 2 hours before, unannounced, sending no word ahead of him but a single line that had brought the old man hurrying to the side door with a lantern and a face gone pale. "You are certain of it," Corbin was saying, very low, his glance flicking now and again to the crowd. "After all this time, there will be no crack in it? No thread for them to pull? For if there is the smallest flaw, they will find it. Lady Farrington has a lawyer of her own, and they will tear at it like dogs." "Let them tear," Reeves said, his voice dry as a turning page. From within his black coat he drew a flat packet wrapped in oiled silk and bound about with faded ribbon, and he rested his long hand upon it, as a man might rest his hand upon a Bible to swear. "It is sound, Corbin, drawn sound, and witnessed sound, and kept sound these 7 years, sealed and lodged where no Farrington hand could ever reach it." Edmund saw to that himself, in the last spring of his life, when he knew what was coming and knew what they were. The whole of Wrenholt, the hall, the home farm, the wood, the water, the rents, devised entire and without condition to his daughter, born of his own true and lawful marriage, and hidden away for her own safety when the marriage was denied and the mother driven off and the child called by another name. He tapped the packet once. "It is all here. And tonight it is spoken." Corbin passed a trembling hand across his mouth. He wanted the very spectacle of it. "Let it be done where they can all see, Corbin," he said to me near the end. "Let them show themselves first, and then let her show herself. I'll not have her creep into her own house by a side door and beg them to believe her. I thought it a dying man's fancy. I never thought I'd live to set it in motion." "You will do more than set it in motion," Reeves said. "When the lanterns are called down, and the masks with them, you and I will stand up and read what is written, and then we will need her, willing, composed, ready to be seen for what she is. Is she ready? That is a great deal to ask of a girl who has been trod upon under her own roof for the better part of a year. Some would have broken. Some would have flown at them long since. You do not know her, Mr. Reeve, said Corbin softly, and there was something in his face now that was almost pride, almost tears. She has not been trod upon. She has been waiting. There is a difference, sir. Give me a moment with her. She should hear it from a friend before she hears it from the law. Reeve inclined his head and withdrew into the shadow of the chrysanthemums, and Corbin went out to fetch her. He came to her quietly along the edge of the light, and he did not summon her the way Julian had. He only stopped near her elbow and bent his silver head. Miss Adelaide, if you would come. There is someone arrived who ought to speak with you, and there is little time before the unveiling. She turned to him, and for the first time that whole long evening something moved behind the calm of her face, not alarm, but a swift and searching attention, the look of a woman who has been listening for a particular footstep down a long corridor and has finally faintly heard it. "He is come, then," she said. It was not quite a question. "He is come," said Corbin, "with it, sealed and whole, just as your father left it." His old voice thickened. "It is tonight, my dear, if you will have it so." Adelaide set the little dog down upon its cushion with a care that did not match the sudden hard beating of her heart, and let Corbin draw her into the shallow alcove where the tall man in black inclined his austere head to her as though she were already what she was. "Miss Vane," said Mr. Reeve. "Mr. Reeve," she answered, and if her voice was lower than usual it did not shake. "My father spoke of you at the end. He said that if ever a man could be trusted to hold a thing safe in a nest of thieves, it would be Alistair Reeve, who never in his life could be made to like anybody, and so could never be bought by them either." A dry flicker crossed the solicitor's long face, the ghost, perhaps, of a smile. "He said very much the same of me to my face. I took it for the compliment he meant." He rested his hand upon the packet within his coat. "You know what this is." "I know what it is," said Adelaide, and now at last she let herself look, not at the packet, but up and out, across the whole glittering cruel width of the room, to the warm dark eyes of the man in the old green coat who had loved her enough to hide her, and had trusted her enough to make her wait. Her throat tightened, and still she did not weep. She had promised herself she would not weep until it was done. "I have carried his name folded up inside me for a year, small enough that no one thought to look for it. There were nights I wondered whether I carried it out of obedience to a dead man's wish, or only out of fear of what would happen when I set it down." "And now?" Reeve asked, watching her as a man watches to see whether a bridge will bear the weight before he sends the carriage across. Adelaide looked once more toward the portrait, and then at the old steward, whose kind eyes were bright with unshed tears, and then at Julian laughing among the people who believed the house was already his, and whatever had held her upright and gray and silent through all the long months of small, unnumbered cruelties seemed to gather itself now, quietly, and settle into something harder and steadier than patience. "Now," she said, "I find I am not afraid of setting it down at all. Only tell me the hour, and I will meet it." "Soon," said Reeve. "When the master of ceremonies calls the lanterns down for the harvest unveiling, the masks come off with them. That is the custom of the house. Every face bared at once, at the turning of the year. Your father, I begin to think, chose his season as carefully as he chose his solicitor. Stay near. When Corbin gives the sign, come to the front, say nothing, and let the paper speak first. It will say a great deal. And then," said old Corbin, low and fierce and trembling, "then, my dear, you may say whatever you like. And there is not one soul in this hall with the standing to bid you be quiet." Adelaide almost smiled, the first thing near a smile that had touched her mouth all evening, and though it did not reach fullness, it warmed her eyes, and for a moment the gray companion was quite gone, and something else looked out of her that made even the austere Mr. Reeve straighten a little where he stood. But it was not the hour yet. And so Adelaide thanked the two men in a voice gone quiet and even once again, and stepped back into the full gold light of the ballroom, back into her grayness, back into the character she had worn so long and would wear now only a little while longer. She had not gone 6 steps before Lady Farrington found her, sweeping across the floor in her emerald silks. "There you are, wandering off. My shawl, girl. The room has gone cold as a crypt by these windows, and my poor Fidel is shivering. You have let him take a chill. Really, Vane, there is nothing you can be trusted to do but stand about looking wronged." Adelaide draped the shawl about her ladyship's shoulders with hands perfectly gentle and perfectly steady, and gathered up the shivering little dog. "Of course, my lady, I am sorry the window was cold." She said it without a trace of irony, and that, somehow, was worse for Lady Farrington than insolence would have been. For insolence she could have punished, and this quiet, flawless yielding gave her nothing to strike at. She found, as Julian had found, something at the bottom of that calm she could not name and did not like, some steadiness that did not belong to a beaten thing. "Well," she said at last, recovering her cruelty as one recovers a dropped fan, "keep to the side. I'll not have you cluttering the hearth where you'll be seen." And she swept away to be admired some more, leaving Adelaide standing with the little dog against her gray breast, quite composed, beneath the great portrait of the man in the green coat. And Adelaide lifted her eyes at last to her father's painted face. Only for an instant, only long enough for the two of them to share the secret one final time across the crowded, glittering, unsuspecting room, and then lowered them again, and folded her hands, and waited as the musicians drew the waltz toward its close, and somewhere above the swaying amber lanterns, the master of ceremonies took up his little silver bell to call the company to the harvest unveiling. The lanterns had been raised on their long poles now, each one a globe of amber fire, their light falling golden across the upturned faces of the guests as Lady Ophelia Farrington lifted one gloved hand into the hush before she spoke. "Friends," she said, with the practiced warmth of a woman who had rehearsed this moment before her glass a dozen times, "we have come to the hour of unveiling. Renholt has stood these many years without a master, mourning the great Lord Edmund, whom we all loved so dearly." She pressed her jeweled fingers to the emerald silk over her heart, and the diamonds at her throat threw cold splinters of lantern fire. "But mourning cannot last forever. Tonight, in the sight of every soul who matters in this county, we shall lift our masks and crown the true heir of this hall." A murmur of pleasure moved through the glittering circle, a soft rustle like wind through dry wheat. They knew what was meant to happen. They had known for weeks. The thing was arranged, agreed, expected, and the only pleasure left in it was the pleasure of watching it performed. Adelaide stood where she had stood all evening, a little apart, near the tall dark shape of the portrait, her plain dove-gray mask still fixed over the upper half of her face, her hands folded quietly before her, watching the scene unfold with those calm, knowing eyes that no one in that bright company had ever troubled to look into. "Julian," Lady Farrington said, turning, extending her hand toward her nephew with a flourish that set her bracelets chiming. "Dearest Julian, come and be known." And Julian Farrington came, the way he did everything, with an easy, gliding confidence, the gold embroidery on his coat catching the light so that he seemed to move in a small private glow of his own making. He was smiling behind his fine harlequin mask, the smile living in the set of his shoulders and the tilt of his handsome head. He reached the low dais where his aunt stood and turned to face the crowd, and raised his own hand to his mask, ready to strip it away and show them all the face of the master of Renholt. The guests leaned in. Somewhere a woman gave a small delighted sigh. "Before he does," said a voice, "I must ask him to wait." It was not a loud voice. It did not shout, did not strain, did not climb over the murmur of the crowd. It simply spoke, dry and level and certain, and something in its very calm cut through the golden noise more sharply than any cry could have done. Heads turned. The rustle of silk stilled. Mr. Alistair Reeve stepped out from the shadow of the colonnade where he had been standing, unremarked all this while. He had not bothered with a mask at all. so that his lean, weathered face and cool gray gaze were plain for everyone to see. In his hands he carried a flat leather folio, worn at the corners, and he held it the way a man holds a thing he knows to be worth more than the room he stands in. Lady Farrington's smile did not so much fall as freeze. "Mr. Reeve," she said, and the warmth had gone out of her voice as though a door had been opened onto winter. "I do not recall your name upon the list of guests. No, you would not. I invited myself. A solicitor may do that when the business is grave enough." He came forward another few steps, unhurried, "And this business, my lady, is very grave indeed. You have spoken of the true heir of Renholt. It is precisely of the true heir that I have come to speak." "This is not the place," Julian began, and his voice had lost a little of its silk. "It is exactly the place," Reeve said, and for the first time an edge came into the dryness, cold and thin as frost. "You have gathered every person of consequence in the county to witness a crowning. Then let them witness the truth of what they are asked to crown. Lord Edmund was a great believer in fairness. I knew him 30 years. At the plain mention of the dead man, a hush came down over the whole gathering, deeper and more uneasy than the hush before, and in it the small sounds of the night became suddenly audible. The creak of the lantern poles, the far-off settling of the harvest fires, the wind moving in the elms beyond the terrace. Reeve opened the worn leather folio. "I hold here the last will and testament of Edmund, Lord Renholt. Not the paper that has been passed about these last months as though it were gospel. The true will. Drawn in his own hand in the spring before his death, signed by him, witnessed by 2 men of standing whose marks are here upon it, and sealed with his own seal, which many of you will remember, for he wore the ring every day of his life." He lifted the document so the lantern light fell full upon the dark ribbon and the disk of red wax. "It has been kept safe. It has been kept quiet. Tonight it will be kept quiet no longer." "That document is a forgery," Lady Farrington said, and now her voice was sharp as a blade drawn quick from its sheath. "A cruel and clumsy fabrication. Edmund left everything to his nearest kin. That is the law. That is the natural order. My nephew, your nephew," Reeve said, "is Lord Edmund's nephew by marriage only, and stands nowhere in the line of his blood. He let that settle. Lord Edmund had a child of his own body, a daughter. Living." The word went through the crowd like a stone through still water, the ripples spreading outward in gasps and whispers, and the small helpless turning of head to head. A daughter. Living impossible, everyone knew there was no daughter. Everyone had always known. "There is no daughter," said Lady Farrington, but something had happened to her face, some small fracture beneath the powder and the poise, and those nearest to her saw it, and did not forget it. "There is," Reeve said. "There has been all along. She was sent away as a small child after her mother died, for reasons Lord Edmund confided to very few, save to say that he believed, wrongly, that he was protecting her by keeping her hidden. He meant to bring her home and name her before the world. Death came for him first, as it comes for all our best intentions. But he did not leave her unprovided. He left her Renholt. The whole of it, house and land and name. It is written here, in his hand, and I will read it aloud to any magistrate in England who cares to hear it." And now a second figure moved. From among the servants and lesser folk permitted to stand at the margins came old Mr. Corbin, silver-haired and slow and utterly unafraid, his kind, steady eyes fixed upon one point in all that bright confusion, and the point was Adelaide. He crossed the open ground before the dais with the unhurried gait of a man who has waited many years for a short walk and means to take every step of it with dignity. The crowd parted for him without quite knowing why. He came to where Adelaide stood beside the great dark portrait, and he stopped, and for a moment his composure trembled, and his eyes grew bright. "My lady," he said, very low, so that only she and those closest could hear. "He asked me to keep the secret until the day it could be spoken safely. I will not keep it one moment longer." And Corbin raised his gnarled, patient hands and lifted the plain dove gray mask from Adelaide's face. She let him. As it lifted, the lantern light fell full upon her, upon the calm chestnut-framed face, upon the quiet, knowing eyes that were no longer hidden, and there was in her no triumph, no flush of victory, no cruel answering smile, only a great and settled stillness, the stillness of a woman who has known who she was for a long time and has merely been waiting, patiently, for the world to catch up to the knowledge. For one heartbeat, no one understood. And then someone did. A thin, nervous woman in rose-colored silk who had laughed earlier at the plain drab creature who fetched and carried for Lady Farrington. Now her fan dropped from her fingers. Her gaze had gone from Adelaide's unmasked face to the great painted likeness of the late Lord Edmund Renhold, warm-eyed and dignified, looking down as he had looked down all night. And her hand rose slowly to her mouth, for they were the same. The line of the brow, the set of the eyes, that steady, level regard, that quiet depth, the turn of the jaw, the shape of the mouth, even the way the head was carried, the living face and the painted one, the daughter and the father, set side by side beneath the swaying lanterns for every soul in the county to see. It was written in flesh and pigment, plain as a signature, and once seen it could not be unseen. The whisper became a low swelling tide of astonishment that rolled back through the whole assembly, guest telling guest, masks lowering from stunned faces as though they had become an embarrassment in the face of so bare a truth. Look at the portrait. Look at her face. You see it, Reeve said quietly. He had not raised his voice, but in the new hush it carried to every corner of the terrace. Of course you see it. You have all been looking at that portrait for years, and you looked at it tonight as you passed beneath it to take your wine. You simply never thought to look at the woman standing beside it, because you had been told she was no one. He closed the leather folio with a soft, dry snap. You were told wrong. Julian had not moved. He stood upon the dais with his hand still half raised toward the mask he had not, in the end, removed, and the easy glow had gone entirely out of him. His handsome face, when at last he lowered his own mask, was pale and rigid, and his eyes went from Reeve to Corbin to Adelaide and back again, searching each in turn for some crack where the thing might yet be pried apart. He found none, and the crowd, which had gathered to see him crowned, was already turning away from him by small degrees of instinct. "This is madness," Lady Farrington said, but her voice cracked upon the word, and the hearing of it undid something in her. She turned to the guests, spreading her jeweled hands in appeal. "You know me. You know my nephew. You know this house. Will you stand here and let a solicitor's paper and a servant's tale and the chance likeness of a companion overturn everything you know?" But the faces she turned to would not meet her eyes. That was the exact and perfect justice of it, and she felt it land. These were the very people who had preened at her side, who had scorned the gray companion because Ophelia Farrington had shown them. With a curl of her lip, that scorn was the fashionable thing. And now, just as gladly, they abandoned her, because the wind had turned, and there was nothing in that circle so constant as its worship of whichever way the wind was blowing. One by one, their gazes crept back, ashamed and hungry and awed, to the calm young woman by the hearth. Mr. Corbin turned to face them all. He was an old man, and his voice was not strong. But he had carried the master's secret in his breast for a decade, and it gave him a weight that no diamond in that company could match. I served Lord Edmund 40 years. I was with him the day the child was born, and the day he sent her away weeping, and I was with him at the last, when he could barely lift his hand, and he took mine in his and made me swear. He said to me, Corbin, my girl will come home to Renholt, and when she does, you will know her, for she has my face and her mother's patience, and you will see that she is given what is hers. The old man's voice did not break, though it might have. I gave him my word. I have kept it. There she stands. There stands the daughter of Edmund Renholt, the rightful mistress of this hall. And I will say so to God and the king and any man who cares to call me liar. No one called him liar. Not one voice rose, and the silence that answered him was the loudest sound of the whole long night. It pressed upon Lady Farrington, who stood alone now upon her little dais with her frozen smile and her cold diamonds, and her nephew stiff and stricken at her side, islanded in a crowd that had been theirs an hour ago and was theirs no longer. And through it all Adelaide had not spoken a single word. She stood where the old man had unmasked her, straight and quiet in her plain dove gray, and looked out at the sea of faces that had scorned her. She did not smile, did not weep, did not gloat. She only looked, the way her father looked down from his painted frame, and slowly, one by one, as her calm gaze passed over them, the guests who had laughed at the little gray companion found that they could not hold it, and lowered their eyes, and were still. Reeve stepped to her side, the leather folio held against his breast, and inclined his austere head, and the gesture was a bow, the first of the evening offered to its rightful object. Corbin came to stand at her other hand, and he too bowed his head. And beneath the harvest lanterns, with the portrait of the dead lord looking down upon his living daughter, and the whole county holding its breath, Adelaide Vane at last drew a slow and steady breath of her own, and lifted her chin the smallest fraction. She did not raise her voice. She had never in her life needed to. "You have all been very kind to tell me my place tonight," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a clear, level warmth that carried to the farthest corner of the room. "So permit me, now, to tell you mine." Lady Ophelia Farrington had gone the color of ash beneath her emeralds. She had risen half out of her chair, one jeweled hand splayed against the tabletop, her sharp features stripped of all their practiced serenity. "This is absurd," she said, but her voice cracked on the second word. "Mr. Reeve, whatever theatrics you have arranged, this is a servant, a companion, a gray little nobody I took in out of charity." "You took her in," said Mr. Reeve, and his austere voice fell into the room like a stone into still water, "because Lord Edmund Renholt, upon his deathbed, instructed that his daughter be placed within this house under a plain name, that she might see with her own eyes who among his family and friends deserved her trust, and who deserved only her memory." He lifted the folded document so the whole hall might see the broken seal. "This is his true and final will. Renholt Hall, its lands, its rents, its every stone and acre, pass whole and undivided to his lawful daughter, Adelaide Renholt, whom you have known this season as Adelaide Vane." A sound went through the crowd like wind through wheat as Adelaide raised one hand, not sharply, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had waited a very long time to be permitted such a gesture. "Please," she said, "there is no need to whisper. You may say aloud whatever you have already been saying behind your fans." Julian Farrington had stood through the whole of Reeve's speech with his charming, hollow face fixed in a smile that no longer had anywhere to go. Now that smile came apart at the edges. He stepped forward. "There has been a mistake," he said, and he said it well. He had always said everything well. "My uncle's estate came to my aunt and to me through the proper settlement." There are papers, Adelaide agreed. "Mr. Corbin, would you be so good?" The old steward came forward, and every eye followed him now. In his steady hands he carried a slim iron box, and from it he drew the papers Julian had named, and set beside them the others, the earlier drafts, the letters, the record of a settlement drawn up in haste and secrecy after Lord Edmund's death, and lodged nowhere, witnessed by no one who could not be bought. "These," said Mr. Corbin, and his kind old voice did not shake, "were written after my master was in his grave, by hands that hoped no truer word survived him. I kept the truer word, through 4 years of being called a doddering old fool, through 4 years of watching this house filled with people who would not have wiped the mud from his boots when he lived." He looked at Julian, and there was no malice in the old face, only a great and settled sorrow. "You told me last winter, sir, that I should be pensioned off to a cottage and forgotten. You told me my day was done. I bore it, because I knew whose day was coming." Julian's mouth opened. For the first time all evening no charming thing came out of it. Adelaide moved then, and the whole room moved its attention with her, the way iron filings turn to the lodestone. She crossed the floor unhurried, past the faces she had served and soothed and been mocked by, and came to stand before the great portrait above the hearth, the portrait of a warm-eyed, dignified man in the coat of 30 years ago, a man whose eyes, everyone in that hall now saw, were her eyes exactly. "My father," she said quietly, and let the 2 words hang there. She turned back to the room. "You knew him, most of you, or you claimed to at his own table, eating his own bread, in the very weeks you were arranging to strip his name from the only child he had left. I heard you, Lady Farrington, tell the Countess of Meeble that my father had grown sentimental and foolish at the end and could not be trusted to have known his own mind. I stood behind your chair and filled your glass while you said it." Ophelia flinched as though struck. "I heard you, Miss Ashby, laugh that the old man's daughter had died in some charity ward, and good riddance to the awkwardness of her. I was the awkwardness. I did not die. I was here, pouring your wine." She said it all without heat. That was the terrible thing, the thing that held them. There was no rage in her to push against, only the level, unhurried truth. "I do not tell you these things to shame you," she went on, "though I see that they shame you, and I am not sorry for it. I tell you so that you will understand there is no misunderstanding to be smoothed over, no gracious way to pretend the evening did not happen. It happened. You were seen. My father wished you to be seen, by me, exactly as you are, and now you have shown me, and now it is done." For a long moment no one spoke. The lanterns hissed softly in their brackets. Then Lady Ophelia Farrington, who had built her whole life upon the arts of the drawing-room, made the only play she had left. "Adelaide, my dear," the endearment came out cracked and grotesque, a coin worn too thin to spend. "Surely between us there need be no. We are family, are we not? Blood is blood. Whatever unkindness you imagine you overheard, you must know how these evenings are, how one speaks in jest. I have always known there was something fine in you, something above your station. You have always known," Adelaide said, "that I emptied your wash-basin and mended your gloves and sat up past 2 o'clock reading to you when your headaches would not let you sleep, and you thanked me for none of it, not once in 3 years." She said it gently, almost tenderly, and it landed harder than any curse. You need not perform affection for me now, aunt. I release you from it. I would rather have your honesty, and I think, at last, I am about to have it." She turned to Reeve. "You have read the will. Tell them the rest of what it provides." The solicitor inclined his austere head. "The will makes provision for Lady Ophelia Farrington to remain resident at the dower house at Wrenholt, with an annuity sufficient to her needs, so long as she conducts herself with the decency so conspicuously absent from her conduct toward the late lord's daughter." That provision, he let his cold eyes rest a moment on Ophelia, is discretionary. It rests entirely in the hand of the new mistress of this house. A gasp, half-swallowed, escaped Lady Farrington. She understood that the woman she had scorned as a gray little nobody now held her comfort, her respectability, her very roof in the palm of one plain hand, and might close that hand at any moment. Adelaide let her feel the weight of it. She was not cruel, but she was not a fool, and she had learned the difference between mercy and softness. "You will keep the dower house," she said at last, "and the annuity with it. Not because you have earned it, you have not, but because my father's house does not turn a widow into the road, whatever the widow has done. That is the kind of house he kept, and it is the kind of house I mean to keep." She held Ophelia's eye. "You will live quietly. You will not entertain here. And you will never again, so long as you draw breath under any roof of mine, speak of anyone beneath your station as though they were furniture. If I hear that you have, the annuity ends that same day, and you may discover for yourself how the world uses a gray little nobody with no one to protect her. I know that country well. You would not survive a month in it." Lady Ophelia Farrington sat down. She simply sat, all the glitter gone out of her, a hollow woman in emerald silk, and she did not speak again that night. Julian was made of quicker stuff, and he tried once more, because men like Julian always try once more. "And me?" he said, and there was a new wheedling undernote in his voice that had never been permitted to show while he was the heir. "Cousin Adelaide, whatever my aunt has done, I had no part in it. I only ever acted on the understanding I was given. If there was a fraud, I was as deceived as anyone." "Surely you would not hold a man accountable for signing his name to a false settlement?" Adelaide asked. "Mr. Reeve, whose signature is that upon the second page?" "Mr. Julian Farrington's," said Reeve, "witnessed by his own hand, dated some 11 days after Lord Edmund's death, disposing of an estate he knew to have an heir living. It is, in the plain language of the law, an attempt to obtain property by fraud. It would go very badly for him in any court in the land." The color left Julian's polished face. The room, which an hour ago would have died for a smile from him, drew back the way a crowd draws back from a man the tide has already condemned. "But," said Adelaide, and the single word stopped Julian where he swayed, "I do not think it need go to any court. Courts are slow and public, and they punish the guilty by making a long spectacle of them. And I have had my fill of spectacle for one evening." She considered her cousin, her charming, hollow, frightened cousin, with something that was almost pity, and was certainly not forgiveness. "You will sign before you sleep tonight a full renunciation of every claim upon Wrenholt, witnessed by Mr. Reeve. You will be gone from this house by morning. There is a modest sum settled on you in my father's true will, more than you deserve, and less than you hoped, and you will take it and make of yourself, if you can, some honest thing. You are young. You have your health, your wit, and your name, and none of those did I have when I came here. I made a life without them. Perhaps you can make one with them. But you will make it elsewhere. Wrenholt is closed to you. Do not come back to it, Julian. Not at Christmas, not at my wedding, not at my funeral. You spent an inheritance you had not earned, and I am collecting it in the only coin I want from you, your absence. Julian Farrington looked at her for a long moment. Whatever was still human in him seemed to understand, at last, that there was nothing to charm here, no crack to slip a smile through. He bowed stiffly and rather badly, for it was the first true thing he had done all evening, and turned and walked the long length of the great hall alone, and the crowd let him pass, and the great doors closed behind him with a sound like a book being shut. Then Adelaide turned to the two old men who had kept faith. "Mr. Corbin," she said, and her voice changed. All the level judgment went out of it, and something warmer came in, something that trembled just slightly at the edges after all. "You called yourself a doddering old fool a moment ago. You are the least foolish man I have ever known, and the most loyal, and I will not have you spend one more night wondering whether your day is done. You will be steward of Renholt for as long as you wish the office, and the moment you no longer wish it, there is a cottage on the south rise, the one with the plum trees that looks down over the whole valley, and it is yours, freehold, with a pension that will let you sit in its garden and be waited upon for a change. My father meant to give it you and did not live to. I am doing it now." The old steward's steady eyes filled, and he did not try to hide it. "I only kept my word, my lady. That is all." "You kept my whole life," Adelaide answered softly, "in an iron box, for 4 years, against every man who told you to burn it. Do not tell me it was nothing." She looked then at the solicitor. "Mr. Reeve, my father chose you because you could not be moved, not by money, not by fear, not by a whole society telling you that you were a stubborn, difficult man. You were all those things. You were also right, and you were also true, and the two are worth more than all the charm that walked out of that door just now. You will manage the legal affairs of this estate for as long as you are willing, at your own fee, and I will never once ask you to bend a thing you believe. A house needs at least one person who cannot be flattered. I should like it to be you." The austere man permitted himself, for the first time in anyone's memory, the ghost of a smile. "It would be my honor," he said, "Miss Renholt." The name went round the room again. Renholt, Renholt. No longer a whisper of scandal, but a fact the whole county would carry home tonight and repeat for years. That the little gray companion at the harvest masque had been the heiress of the hall all along, and had claimed it not with fury, but with a grace that shamed every proud face in the room. Adelaide walked back to the hearth and stood beneath her father's portrait, and the lantern light fell warm across them both, the painted man with his dignified, warm eyes, and the plainly dressed young woman below him whose eyes were his own. She reached up, quite simply, and laid her fingertips for a moment against the gilded frame, the way one touches the shoulder of someone who has been weighted for a very long time. "I am home," she said, so quietly that perhaps only Corbin, standing near, truly heard it. "I am home, Father, and I have seen them all, exactly as you wished, and I will keep your house the way you kept it, with a roof for the widow, and a chair for the old, and a plain word for the proud, and a door that opens to anyone the world has decided is nobody." She let her hand fall. "You were right to wait. I know now what to do with it." Beyond the tall windows, the last of the harvest lanterns were being lit along the terrace, a long chain of small warm flames running out into the autumn dark, and the great hall of Renholt glowed golden around its new mistress. The music began again, softer now and somehow truer, and one by one the guests who had scorned her came, with lowered eyes and careful courtesy, to pay their respects to Adelaide Renholt, who received each of them with the same unhurried, level kindness she had shown when she was nobody at all. For that, in the end, was the whole of her victory, and she knew it. Not that she had risen above them, but that she had never needed to. She had been, all along and beneath every plain gray stitch of her, exactly who she was now revealed to be. And the only thing that had changed was that at last they had eyes to see it. And under her father's warm painted gaze, in the soft gold of the harvest light, Adelaide Renholt took her place at the head of her own hall, and was, quietly and completely, home.